Well, today is a Tuesday. It's August the 28th. Again, Political Science 171. And our focus today is on Chapter 1, as well as, um, hmm, yes, the article by Michael Parenti. So, what I would like you to do is to watch this video, Fight for Democracy. But I want to say something very quickly about the fight for democracy dealing with South Korea. It's a story about how South Korea, one, started out as an authoritarian country. There's some comparison also to North Korea, and I think Sean Dacey will be able to give you some interesting insights since he's just come back from North Korea as well as South Korea. But how the two countries, their fortunes completely diverged over time. I think it's an interesting story in and of itself. But I want you to think about it this way. How did South Korea change its political system over time? Right? You have the rise of the middle class. What was the role of the middle class? And women in particular, what kind of role did women play in the democratization of South Korea? I want you to definitely focus on that. Also keep in mind the role of the media, like the press in particular, and the role that they played. And keep in mind the Cold War context, which is talked about in the introduction as well as chapter 1. Right? What period are we talking about? 1945 to 1991. Cold War technically ended with the dissolution of what's then known as the Soviet Union. Um, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and now it's frequently referred to as um, Russia and the successor states, referring to the successor states from USSR. Okay, so we will stop there. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is um, discuss a chapter 1. So this is August the 30th when you should be viewing this clip. And this chapter in, again, this book here, the Garner book, by now you should have bought your book. If you haven't bought your book, if you're really nice, you might be able to have a discussion with Laura and be able to actually get a chapter or two copied. Um, but I didn't tell you that because that would be a violation of copyright protection. Um, okay, that is part of capitalism, which is something we will talk about today. Okay, the first concept that comes out is state. Right? You can't really talk about politics without talking about the state. Right? And what do we mean by the state? The state is defined in a variety of ways, depending on what kind of a philosophical or theoretical perspective you come from. So, I think we should try to come up with some kind of idea about what we mean by a state. And we talked about the state having the authority to exercise power. But there are different kinds of states with different levels of power. The book talks about the night watchman state. Well, that's kind of a silly definition, silly term, I would say. I'd prefer to call it the liberal state. But based on the philosophies of John Locke, uh, second treatise on government, also um, mm, Adam Smith. The idea behind that is not that the state is, liberal in the sense that the way that the term is used as being, left socialist. That's not the definition of a liberal state. Liberal, the root word is liberty. So the idea here is free. So the state is limited so that liberty, right, can be exercised. Liberty in what sense? Two particular ways that I'd like to emphasize. One is in an economic sense, the ability to be able to engage in economic enterprise without excessive intrusion by the government. That's a liberal state. The other idea about the liberal state is the whole idea of personal freedom, right? The ability to be able to assemble, the ability to be able to practice the religion of your choice, or to not practice any religion. Um, the ability to be able to move, freedom of movement. So that's what we mean by a liberal state. So that comes from a certain philosophical orientation. This is the Western European, in particular British sort of thinking. See, because historically speaking, conservatives, uh, the aristocracy in the United Kingdom, tended to monopolize power, and those who were opposed to it favored a more liberal state, a state that would allow people to have a greater degree of freedom without undue influence of those aristocratic elites at that time. So that's one model. Okay. Another model that the book talks about is the developmental state. Incidentally, the developmental state, many people view it as having been quite instrumental in bringing about economic and political development in East Asia. So Japan, South Korea, Singapore, some people say Malaysia, and then now even possibly China. Right? The state playing an active role in guiding the economy, controlling social behavior, and working with private industry to promote economic growth and development. That's what we mean by developmental state. And actually, my paper, which I will be presenting at the end of this month, deals with the developmental state, which is a hot topic actually in South Africa. How can we capacitate the state to deliver basic services like what? Water, electricity? Because you have to keep in mind that South Africa is a country where first world meets third world. So there's a large segment of the population no access to clean water or limited access to electricity and health care, for example. It's a pretty high HIV rate. And so the issue becomes people expect government to do something about this, to deliver services. But the government has not been able to do this. So the argument becomes, can we use the developmental state model for service delivery? And my paper actually critiques that kind of approach. And I argue that the developmental state is not a good model, in particular because it is tied to authoritarianism and an authoritarian past where power was highly concentrated in the hands of a few. Now, that doesn't mean that an authoritarian system necessarily promotes economic growth, right? Chile under Pinochet, yes, promoted economic growth. Concentrated power, backed up by the military, usually secret police, can promote economic development. It can promote modernization, movement away from a traditional society. But it can also lead to what I call the self-aggrandizement, or sometimes called neo-patrimonialism, where the political elite essentially hijacked the entire political system for their own benefit. An example of such a system would be Zimbabwe today. under Robert Mugabe. So when you think about power, I don't want you to think about power as being either you have it or you don't. But try to think about it as a continuum. More power, less power, right? Sort of, right? This way, that way, and degrees of power. So, for example, um, give you an example. Authoritarianism on the continuum, more power, right? Um, liberal democracy or liberal state, less power. Okay, that's how I'd like you to think about things. Okay, so there are a couple of ideologies that are mentioned that you should be familiar with. One is liberalism. What does it mean? What is its origins? What are its assumptions about government? This is in the area of what we call political theory or political thought. The other one is um, Marxism, right? The Marxist ideas about, in particular, the relationship between capitalism or the economy and politics. What does Marxism say about political organization? In contrast to what liberalism says. And in relation to liberalism, the whole notion of a social contract, I think, is really important. Why does government exist? Government exists because people got together and said, look, we don't want negative freedom where you have the freedom to kill everybody and it's either kill or be killed. Let us come together, set up a system of rules and procedures, right, and enter into a contract. And that contract between individuals and the state would provide a degree of protection, right, from the excesses of negative freedom. Okay, now that's the idea of the social contract. However, however, there are those who would argue that the social contract can be broken by the state. For example, if the state unjustly uses power, um, and therefore people have the right to basically replace that state. Then there's the other view, sort of a Thomas Hobbes Leviathan, that the state, you know, you can't replace the state. Replacing the state would lead to anarchy, a war of all against all kind of arrangement. So you have to tolerate the authoritarianism. Okay. Um, so that's sort of the logic of the liberal state. You keep pushing that idea of the liberal state and the fact that you can't rebel against that state, then you end up with an authoritarian system, right? Because you have to tolerate it. Um, Now, there's a new kind of thinking that exists. It's called neoliberalism. Neo, obviously, meaning new. And according to this sort of set of ideology, government has become too powerful. The book talks about this in the context of called New Right. Okay, the state has become so powerful in contemporary life that um, you know, what we need to do is you get rid of the power of the state, right? It's become the state has become so powerful that it needs to be broken down and made less powerful. Okay, and how do you do that? Well, neoliberals argue that what you need to do is you need to increase the power of market forces. The government shouldn't intervene in things. The market should decide how things should be done. We want a very small government to go back to the first principles. You hear this all the time in American politics. for example, and right-wing parties in Europe, right? The emphasis in particular on traditional values, right? The importance of doing the right thing, even if it doesn't benefit society as a whole. Forget about this utilitarian, non, um, uh, how shall I put it, non-ethical ideas of utilitarianism, where how do you make a decision? Does it benefit society or not, as a whole? That kind of calculation can be argued is not necessarily desirable. Okay, now there's another set of theories, right, that deals with what a state should do. So a state could, one, try to maximize everyone's happiness. That's utilitarianism. Do what's best for the majority of the people, right? Then the liberal state, so idea of a limited a state, and that there's a social contract, um, and the government has a responsibility to protect people. So you can see how then that leads to the establishment of a welfare state. Government should eradicate poverty. Government should make sure that people have a right to to education, health care, food, jobs. And the rebellion against that is this neoliberal idea that the state just can't be providing all of these things. The school that I tend to be quite sympathetic to is this whole idea of the hollowed out state. Because we live in a neoliberal world where corporations have become so powerful, I argue, that this argument goes, that sovereignty has been diminished. Well, what does that mean by diminished sovereignty? Well, let's look at it this way. So, let's suppose you live in, pick a place. Oh, Buffalo, New York. Everybody picks on Buffalo, New York, right? So, I too will pick on Buffalo, New York. Well, the economy's not doing well there. What else is new? So people say, well, this is the responsibility of the mayor of Buffalo. We should get a new mayor. The mayor says, I don't have control over this. I'm not causing this. We live in New York State. There are New York State issues here. So who do you blame? The governor? Well, the governor will say, well, wait a minute here. All the Northeast and Midwest is experiencing economic problems. As a matter of fact, the entire country is experiencing economic problems. Point the finger to President Obama. Well, President Obama says, well, wait a minute here. I can't be responsible for what's going on in Europe today. I can't be responsible for the slowing down of the Chinese economy. In other words, this is the era of globalization, where your sovereignty and the power of the state, the authority of the state, has been hollowed out. Diminished sovereignty. You don't control your own destiny. I mean, that's nonsense. This argument would say that we live in such an interdependent world, right, that you don't have the authority to do the kinds of things that you normally thought you could. And you don't have the power to do it either. Right? So I hope I haven't confused you, right, about the different perspectives that are out there. But when you listen to NPR or watch the news, you'll get a pretty good idea about, oh, okay, well, this argument is about the hollowed out state. Or, okay, this is a utilitarian argument. Or, oh, I can see some aspects of neoliberalism here. Or, this is fundamental to the liberal state, right, way of thinking about things. Yeah. That's the whole point here. Okay, well, we will end for now. And I will see you in a couple of days. Okay, well, welcome to what today should be September the 4th. And at the end of class today, we will have a quiz. So what I'd like to do, by the way, it's open book, open notes. What I'd like to do is go over a few things from chapter 2. We won't finish all of chapter 2. We'll finish most of it, but we won't finish all of it. Okay. First thing I want to point out is the idea of power. We've already discussed the idea of the state. And the state exercises power, we say. Well, what does that mean? Well, power, we say, is the ability to get someone to do something that you want, that they may not otherwise do. Like what? Well, you may be afraid of punishment, or they're able to provide benefits or rewards, right? Or they will reward you for doing something. Sort of like a carrot and stick, right? The exercise of carrots and sticks. When we say somebody exercises power, that means that they can, you know, manipulate you. They can, right, modify your behavior. Okay. So when we say someone is very powerful, that means that they have the capacity to do this, almost at will. So this is kind of interesting. So you can ask, well, how did they get this power? Right? Where did it come from? Is it infinite or is it finite? Does the use of power decrease it or does it increase it? Well, the answer to that question is actually quite complicated. Now, I'm not trying to be flip here. How you exercise power can increase your power. How you exercise it can decrease your power. So this leads to the legitimate use of power or the authority. So, for example, a police can come to you, right, and pull you over and pull a gun out and blow your brains out. There's the power to do that. Right? And furthermore, could make you run for your life. That gun makes you run for your life, something that you otherwise would not do. They're very powerful. But on what authority did this officer do this? Was it a legitimate use of power? The answer to that is no. So power is most effective when it is used legitimately, and that goes with this, for the state also. Right? Governments that use power legitimately are more effective. Those who use it illegitimately reduce their political capital and undermine their own existence, their own legitimacy. Legitimacy, the moral right to govern. And they may weaken themselves so much that there may be a military takeover, they may be voted out of office, they may even be assassinated. Now, where does this, authority come from? Three different sources, according to Max Weber, famous sociologist. He says it can come from tradition, such as religion, or custom, or from monarchy, divine right rule, where the monarch says, my power comes from God. You have no choice but to obey me. I exercise this power. It is a legitimate use of power because God has given this to me. I am God's representative on earth. Or another traditional authority is to appeal to religion. For example, the authority of my regime is based on Sharia law. And Sharia law, as long as I protect Sharia law and emphasize the importance of Sharia law to societal organization, I have the authority, translate that as the um, the moral right to govern, legitimate use of power, that is, uh, um, yeah, to rule. So that's sort of this traditional authority. Now, charismatic authority. Really, when we talk about charismatic, we're now moving towards a modern society, right? And think about the role of technology, the role of media. Think about charismatic leaders such as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, right? At St. Petersburg, uh, delivering his speeches, right, that ignited the passion of the masses, or Adolf Hitler and his speeches that got people to believe in his program, tied to nationalism, the sense of nation, which in turn could even be traditional, but that leader's persuasive ability. That's what we mean by charismatic authority. Well, some of you have probably heard of Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Jonestown, Guyana, where he was able to get everybody, man, child, woman, to drink that Kool-Aid and kill themselves. Right? I think that's where we got this whole idea of you drank the Kool-Aid. Right? So that's charismatic authority. But modern political systems in particular emphasize the importance of what we call legal rational. And what do I mean by legal rational? Constitution, laws, rules, procedures, a bureaucracy to implement rules. So, for example, when somebody goes to get their driver's license, you have to produce certain documentation. You have to fill out certain forms. You can't say, I'm not providing any documentation. It's not an arbitrary process. You produce the documentation, you pass the test, you pay the fee, you get your license, assuming you meet all the criteria that's specified in law and in the regulation. So people argue that you can track a political system's development as it embraces this legal rational, right, and move away from traditional authority and charismatic authority. Um, these are important ideas. So when we talk about political development, how do you develop a democracy, right? In the end, the idea is that you would have as the sort of the penultimate political system, one based on legal rational type of a system, rather than individual personality or traditions. Of course, in reality, the legitimacy, the authority and legitimacy of any political system is derived from all three of these things combined. But they may be weighted differently.